Hello, and welcome to the studio. I'm Silver, and today I'll be showing you how I make my stencils. This is a stencil I made about a year ago. These places, the headpiece and the eyes, will not translate nicely to being part of a stencil. This is because they are supposed to be devoid of color, like in this original stenciling I made for a costume about a year ago. Instead of free floating, they have to be connected to the outer area so that they don't get colored in. So you have to be very conscious of that when you make your own stencils. For this video, I decided to trace my original stencil onto a piece of plastic instead of drawing an entirely new stencil because I didn't know for sure what I would want to do for an original stencil. So you will probably want to use a better pen than I am, like a Sharpie fine liner or something. I'm using an old Faber-Castell. I can see it better than it shows up on film, so you can also take that into account. When you make your own stencil, make sure you don't have any places that are way too skinny because that will make the next step, the cutting out of the stencil, way more difficult for yourself, as well as making stamping your paint onto your stencil more difficult. To cut out my stencil, I used just a normal, I believe most places sell them as craft knives. This one, I believe, is X-Acto brand craft knife. Any craft knife will do. Just make sure you have a sharp blade so that you don't end up slipping and hurting yourself. Depending on how in-depth your design is, you are definitely going to want to stick to your lines. Mine, I messed up a few very minor times, but it's very difficult to tell as long as you keep the general shape of what you're trying to stencil. Like for here, I messed up a couple of lines in the headpiece, the very top, when I was cutting out that part of the stencil, but it turns out just fine because everything stays proportionate to itself, and that's also very important, especially when you're going for something slightly more abstract like a logo instead of being a character itself. The thicker your stencil plastic is, the better it is for both cutting it out and for transferring paint through the stencil. Here I used a rather thin plastic, so it warps a little bit and it comes up when I'm trying to stamp the ink to get it down to show you guys later in the video. It still works, but the more times that you want to use your stencil, the thicker you're going to want it because it will have higher structural integrity than something like very thin, flimsy plastic like I used here. This works as a demonstration for me for this video, which is what I wanted to show was the process more than the upkeep. This was my first attempt at transferring paint through the stencil for this video. I decided to try and use a paint roller instead of using a sponge, which works far better, at least in this case, because my roller got paint absolutely everywhere. I couldn't find the real sponge to use to showcase in this video, so I used a piece of scrap fleece and a little bit of watered down paint to show you guys. And this might have turned out a little crisper if I had taped the edges down, which you will almost certainly want to be doing depending on what you're stamping, or stenciling rather. It turned out just fine for me because this, again, was just a demonstration. I really like how the stencil itself turned out. I hope you guys like this video. Comment if there's any specific art techniques you want to see me use, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye!